Hello, welcome to part 3 in a 3-part series on the Star of Bethlehem. In the first 2 videos in this series, I describe the very convincing evidence that the Star of Bethlehem was on May 27, 7 BC. Now in this third and last video, I'm going to be doing 2 things. One is presenting the idea that perhaps Jesus was not born at exactly the time of the Star of Bethlehem. Now that sounds like a contradiction, some kind of oxymoron. The Star of Bethlehem, by definition, is the star that appeared when Jesus was born. However, if the Star of Bethlehem was not this big, shining, glorious thing in the sky, but instead is something astrological that is very important because of the significance of the way the planets are aligned, not necessarily obvious to the physical eye, which is what I present in those first 2 videos, then if Jesus was not born at exactly the moment that occurred, nobody would really notice or care. The astrologers would. And would the astrologers even care that much? Because the astrologers were looking at that Star of Bethlehem, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the Sun-Moon conjunction, the way that Sun-Moon unfolds with when the Moon contacts Venus and Jupiter and all that beautiful stuff that happens that indicates that the King of the Jews is born. What's important about this in the way that they're thinking as astrologers at that time is that this is a cyclic event. That Jupiter-Saturn conjunction with the new moon only happens once in 1,000 years. And the way Regulus gets brought into it, and the whole thing is so perfect, and it's in Pisces, etc. It's just the perfect sign from divinity in the sky that the new King of the Jews has arrived. Is it really important that the baby is born at that moment? I think the idea here is not so much that we have the perfect birth chart of the new King, the new Savior, the new Messiah that is perfect in terms of aligning at the exact moment that the new moon is on the horizon. It might just be that is a sign in the sky that it's happening. It's happening now. The baby should be arriving in this time. We should see it. It's a different way of thinking, of not putting total emphasis on the birth chart. It's a possibility. All I'm saying is this, is that if Jesus was not born at the exact moment on May 27th, he would not even have to be born on May 27th. The sign is in the sky that the Savior is here. That's what it's about. So hopefully you can think about that and feel what I'm saying and how people are looking at the way astrology works. And again, because the emphasis here is on the interpretation and not some big obvious thing in the sky that is so conspicuous everybody runs outside and goes, oh my gosh, look at that thing in the sky, it wouldn't matter so much. So I'm just presenting that as a possibility. We don't know, and we don't really care in terms of the drama of the story, the impact of the story, the impact that Christianity has had on humanity, which is enormous, and the impact that the life of Jesus has had, just huge, enormous effect. And the magic of the story and the way people have been captivated by the story for so long, it's not diminished at all. And there are also some feelings like when the three wise men arrive and they say, "Where is the king?" It's not that they have pinpointed the exact moment to be there. There was a sign that the new king is here, the new Messiah has arrived. Okay, so I just wanted to emphasize that. And another thing related to this is the Jews were waiting for the Messiah. The astrologers are looking in the sky for signs of whether the Messiah is coming. If the Jews were not thinking this way, would Jesus as we know him have been born? We could ask by analogy a similar question. If Einstein was born at the time and place he was born in Germany, but Germany was not a highly literate society and did not have universities and encourage people in the sciences and so on, would Einstein have developed to be Einstein? Well, no, he wouldn't. He wouldn't be the same. We are all connected. We are all part of our experiences are all merged together. We're all part of this same consciousness, same field of activity. And so what we invoke, what we make possible, we do get surprises. Einstein is a surprise. Jesus, in some ways, is a surprise. We have exceptional people who go beyond the bounds of what we expect, but nevertheless, we create an environment. We prepare the way for that to happen. So, the birth of Jesus and the life of Jesus, in a sense, is emphasizing how we prepare a place for our children and for our children's children. The Christmas story is a story of how the Jews prepared a place for Jesus. Preparations are never flawless. Problems arise. The way the story goes, Mary and Joseph were told there's no room at the inn. They are going through this very difficult journey to pay taxes, etc. It's not that we make the perfect way, but the basic potential is made possible by the lifestyle, the interests, the motivations, the development, the whole way of life of the people. So the baby was born at the time and place that the three astrologers expected. I'm just emphasizing here that what's important is that the astrologers identified a message in the sky that the Savior has come, or the Messiah, or however they thought of it at the time. So it's possible that the three wise men arrived after Jesus was born, that the exact time of the birth may not have been at the new moon, and also when Jesus was found later, what was he, like 12 years old or something, and he was in the temple teaching. Is that the same person who was the baby that the three wise men saw? There's no clarity about these things, and I don't think they're important in terms of the message that Jesus brought and the life he lived and the influence that he had on the world. So he may have been born, Jesus may have been born with a spectacular light in the sky, maybe not. There would be no loss of the drama if he was born before or after May 27. It does not diminish the beauty of the Christmas story if he was born before or after that date. And so the Jews prepared the way, and that's the important part of this and its relevance to the Star of Bethlehem. So it's a radical idea. I'm perseverating a little bit on this because we're so accustomed to thinking that there was a sign in the sky. At that moment, the sign, Jesus is born. It may be a little more subtle than that the sign in the sky heralded, it brought the news that the baby is there, not necessarily born simultaneously. Maybe he was, maybe he was not. So I just want to make that point. Everybody can decide for themselves, but historically, from what's in the New Testament, etc. I don't think it's crystal clear exactly how close together these things are. You know, when the three wise men arrive at the birth, the way the story goes, the baby's already born. I don't think they're witnessing the actual birth. You know, Mary's got the baby on her lap, and I don't know. It's just a story, but it's possible that the baby's already born. They ask, where is he? As if he was already born when they arrive, according to the way it reads in Matthew, as I read from in the last video, part 2 of this series. Okay. Now, one last thing, and then I'm going to go into the technical details, which is this. What time of year was Jesus born? Is there any historical evidence? Of course, we celebrate his birthday now on December 25th. December 25th was selected by a pope in, I think it was the 4th century, somewhere around there. And they decided, okay, we're going to celebrate his birth on December 25th. Before that, his date of birth was not known. A lot of the details of the life of Jesus, exactly what he looked like, how tall was he, you know, there's no emphasis on this, and I think that's a good thing. The emphasis is placed on the meaning and not incidental details. Well, here's a quote from a website on the season, the time of year when Jesus was born. The first mention, according to this source, is around 200 A.D., and I'll read this. Finally, in about 200 CE, a Christian teacher in Egypt makes reference to the date Jesus was born. So no other reference is found to the date he was born until 200 years after the birth of Jesus. According to Clement of Alexandria, several different days have been proposed for various Christian groups. Surprising as it may seem, Clement does not mention December 25th at all. He writes, there are those who have determined not only the year of our Lord's birth, but also the day, and they say it took place on the 28th year of Augustus and the 25th day of the Egyptian month Pachon, which is May 20th. Bottom line, I won't read all this. Dates of May 20th, March 21st, April 21st, April 15th, April 20th. These are dates given fairly close to the May 27th. And again, perhaps Jesus was not born on May 27th. Point here is that the fragments, the vague indications we have from the first references to the date of birth of Jesus do agree that it would be late winter, early spring time period when he was born. So that agrees with the date that I'm giving for the Star of Bethlehem, which again is not necessarily exactly the same date as the birthday. Anyway, interesting. The May 20th or 21st could very well agree. Okay, so, okay, you can read this. I don't think I have anything new here. And now we're ready for the last section. I want to just go over some technical details that people may wonder about. So if people are getting right into the details of all this and questioning the analysis I've come up with and various alternative ways of thinking, let's just quickly go over some of those. For example, there are several ways that astrologers consider the sun to be rising. Is the sun rising when in zodiac longitude the sun and moon is the same as the ascendant, which is how we look at it today as astrologers? Were they looking at it the same way then? Or is it the time that the sun and moon are physically seen on the horizon, which is different? And do you use the upper limb? You know, when the first little sliver of the sun appears, that's what's used today, by the way. Sunrise is considered to be when the first little bit of the sun comes above the horizon, or when the middle of the sun is on the horizon, or the whole sun is above the horizon, so you have the full sun there. There's different ways of thinking about sunrise in zodiac longitude, visually. And when you look at it visually, it's different for several reasons that I'll go into than the way we do it today in astrology. Now, the books by Vedius Valens and Ptolemy, written about 150 years later, emphasize zodiac longitude, just like we do today. They also did consider when a planet is physically on the horizon or on the meridian plane. We now call that in mundo. And even though some astrologers emphasized that ancient astrology was very visual, people went out and looked at the sky and would argue that it would be a visual new moon that would be emphasized. And where does that visual new moon occur? Does it still occur in Israel? And if the astrologers had calculated this by a visual method, would they still come up with Israel? These are all questions. My view is the calculations were basically done in zodiac longitude, and determining where something would be conjunct the ascendant was typically done in longitude, even though people may also go out and see what was happening visually. But let's look at what happens if we consider sunrise to be a visual phenomenon rather than zodiac longitude. Is it still in Israel? And if you think about visually, when is the sun rising, there's another issue, which is refraction of light. When a planet is right on the horizon, the light of that planet bends. So do we want to consider refraction of light? The light of the sun and any other celestial object is refracted, in other words, bent by the atmosphere. Similar to how your arm or a stick looks when you put it in water. So if you take a stick or your arm and you put it in water, it looks bent. The water bends the light, so does air. And when an object is overhead or excuse me, or even not that close to the horizon, the refraction of light is almost zero. There's none. But if it's right on the horizon, the light is getting bent. And so the sun, when we see the sun rise, it's actually below the horizon. So the sun is below the horizon, but we see it rising because the light is getting bent. And it gets bent about 34 minutes of arc. It depends on the air temperature and other things. So you would want the sun to be 34 minutes below the horizon. You want it 34 minutes below to determine when the sun is visually rising. So these are all things that would adjust the exact location where the sun would be rising when it was new moon. Okay, so here's what we can do. We can, in the Sirius 3.0 software, we'll select what's called a horizon chart, wheel style C, and it will tell us what the altitude of the sun is. Altitude means distance from the horizon. Okay, that's a lot of talk, but now let me show you something to bring this home. I'm going to select this wheel style C. If I right click, it's over here, C, small technical, because it gives me a lot of information. And I'm going to go over here to settings, coordinate system, and select horizon. This keeps east on the left and south at the top, as we normally do in astrology. And now I have a column of altitude, and it tells me the sun is 0 north 29, which is exactly what we expect. At the time of the new moon, when we look at it in zodiac longitude, the sun and moon are slightly above the horizon, and they are, in fact, slightly above the horizon, about a half a degree. So, let's go back to our PowerPoint. We would want, for the sun to be visually rising, we would want the altitude to be about 0 south 34 to put the middle of the sun rising. So again, there's a difference between, this could be surprising to a lot of astrologers, but there's a difference between what our eyes see and what the astrology chart shows. And one of those reasons is refraction of light. So what we can do is, and by the way, at Nazareth, well, let me go back to this. Further north in Italy, the sun would be even higher. So it suggests that perhaps Jesus was born closer to Jerusalem. Also, where did the kings arrive? I'm suspecting it probably was around Jerusalem that they met with Herod. And that was the focus of their attention. Anyway, the sun is on the ascendant throughout all of Israel anyway. So note that this new moon on May 27, 7 BC was not an eclipse. A new moon could be an eclipse or not an eclipse. Most new moons are not eclipses. Even though the sun and moon are conjunct in zodiac longitude, they are not at the same point in the sky. We see that the latitude of the moon is 2 north 09. When I look at this chart wheel, it tells me here, it's a small font, so maybe you can't read it, moon 2 north 09. This means at the time of the new moon, the sun was half a degree, more precisely 29 minutes, above the horizon. Altitude means distance from the horizon. The moon is slightly over 2 degrees above the horizon at the time of the new moon. Again, there's a difference between visual and zodiac longitude. I describe all this in a series of videos on astronomy for astrologers, if you're not familiar with this. So, in this bottom paragraph I suspect that the 3 wise men had fairly accurate calculations. We're using calculations in zodiac longitude, just as astrologers normally did at that time and normally still do. Despite the contemporary romantic notion that all ancient astrologers relied heavily on visual observations, they used a combination of visual and zodiac longitude. And when they were doing charts and things like that, they're basically just using zodiac longitude just like we do today. Okay. Now, we can do, let me show you this. Let me put this back to a normal chart. And let's look at the astromap. Here's where the sun and moon at new moon are conjunct the ascendant. Do you see where they would be on the horizon? I can right click and just select in mundo. Click OK. And it shows me that if you were down here, way west of Israel, this is where the moon would be on the horizon at new moon. And the sun does not change. It's still on the horizon a little bit west of Jerusalem. The point is this. New moon happens. When the new moon happens, the sun and moon are not at the same point, and the moon is on the horizon at the time of the new moon down here. So if you think that the ancient astrologers did everything in mundo, number one, and you think they could calculate clearly how things would look in mundo, then the region that would be the perfect place for the Savior to be born would have been a little bit west of Israel in this region. So I'm just presenting that. And if you think they could calculate that accurately, they would have anticipated here. I'm just showing you the different options because I know people will ask about this. They will ask, astrologers will ask, what if the astrologers did it in mundo? They want to know when the moon was on the horizon. And let's suppose they knew how to calculate that. Then they would have been looking at this area probably, between the sun and moon a little bit west of Israel. I think they used longitude. I think they calculated very accurately. And then we have both the sun and moon in Israel. These are technical details for those of you interested in these things and want to sort through the different possibilities. Okay. Note that the ascendant sun and moon are in the same degree just about anywhere in Israel. And when you read Ptolemy, when you read Vedius Valens, they're looking at degrees. When things are in the same degree, they're calling it partile. Realistically, that's how astrologers worked then, and it's how they work now. You could argue differently, and you may come up with a different conclusion, and that's why I'm showing you this, depending on how you want to consider things. Okay. Of course, there's also the issue that we're not calculating as precisely as we can today. Okay, the diameter of the sun is an issue. As I mentioned, is sunrise when the middle of the sun is on the horizon. That's how we calculate things in astrology today, and was probably how they were calculating back then. They say the sun is at this position. It's the center of the sun. So there's a slight difference depending on whether you're looking at when the sun is, if you consider sunrise to be when the sun first is on the horizon, the middle of the sun, or the full sun. If you've been, say, at the beach and you look at sunrise or sunset, you'll see the moment that the first sliver of the sun appears. That's what we call sunrise today. And the time that's given, in different media, is the time that first little bit of the sun appears on a clear day. And then a minute or two later, you'll see the middle of the sun. And a few minutes, and maybe a minute or two after that, the full sun has risen. It takes a little while. If you watch the sun rise, which you can do when you're, at the beach, if the beach is, if the horizon is to the east, you'll see it at sunrise. As the horizon is to the west, where the beach is, where the ocean is, you'll see it at sunset. It takes a few minutes for the full sun to rise or set. Okay, so these are variations. They don't have much effect on where the critically sensitive place on planet Earth was for that new moon. It's basically Israel. And just so you know, the way we define sunrise today is when the sun's altitude is 50 minutes south, 0 south 50. Because when the altitude of the sun is 0 south 50, that's very, very, very close to when visually you would see the sun rising. To give you a sense of this, let's do a time adjust. Let's set this chart to horizon. And this is the time of the new moon, 2 hours, 38 minutes, 39 seconds, Greenwich Mean Time. And I'll go to time adjust, and I'll go 4 minutes earlier. And the sun is 0 south 17, another 4 minutes, 1 south 03. I want a total of 8 minutes. Let me go 1 minute back. 0 south 52. It's 7 minutes earlier. Point is this. If you want to define sunrise the way we do today, as when your eyes see the sun first appear on the horizon, if the horizon's perfectly flat, as it is when you look out at the ocean, that was 7 minutes earlier. And the location where this is, I could save this. I can save this chart, save as new entry, and I'll call this visual sunrise. Click OK. Okay, now I've saved this chart 7 minutes earlier. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Okay, visual sunrise. This is the chart for 7 minutes earlier when the sun is 0 south 52. A few seconds later, it's going to be exactly 0 south 50. So very, very close to this time. And I can do, let's set it back to zodiac longitude. I can coordinate system zodiac longitude, and I can do an astromap for this. I'll go to map, astromap, select Israel. I better zoom out because it might be pretty far from here. And I'll do a basic map. And this shows you that the sun, oh, that's interesting. Let me zoom in. I'm going to right click and zoom in. Oh, I didn't expect that. Very interesting. Move up a little bit. Keep it on a basic map. This is interesting, is that if you define sunrise visually, yeah, wow, this is very interesting. Define sunrise visually the way we do today. When the first sliver, just a little bit of the sun appears over the horizon to your eye. Remember, your eye is seeing something a little bit illusory in the sense that we're seeing how light got bent by air. The sun is actually below the horizon. But we would see the sunrise going very, very close to Nazareth. Isn't that interesting? Let me show it to you this way. Let's put Nazareth in the map so you can just see it. Nazareth, Israel. Remember, as I explained in the first videos, there's some debate about where Jesus was born. Was he born near Nazareth or was he born near Jerusalem? And I don't think this is really important in terms of the story, but some of you may think it is, and maybe you think the astrologers calculated with extreme precision. So just so we know how things look, we're doing an in mundo map of I didn't unselect some things. Let me unselect this. Nazareth. I want just these conjunctions. Here's Nazareth right here. So if you do it visually, it's going right through northern Israel instead of southern Israel. The sun and the moon is on the south side. The middle of them is going right through the middle of Israel. So in other words, if you do it visually, the new moon is going to be very close to this time, and this is where the sun would be on the horizon. Interesting. Okay. All right. So a few minutes later, it would be right there. Anyway, they're all in the area of Israel. That's the important point. Okay. So I'm just mentioning these technical variations of different ways things can be defined. In mundo, taking account of refraction of light, etc. So here's the bottom line. Regardless of what variation calculation is used, at the moment that the sun and moon were exactly conjunct, they were rising in Israel. And I think that this is why the three wise men picked Israel as the place. One of the big reasons for the birth of the Messiah. Okay, we're assuming that their calculations were highly accurate. Highly accurate meaning within minutes of what we can calculate today. Okay, I want to mention this too, because people have actually asked me about this. Did the Star of Bethlehem come overhead? Overhead meaning the zenith, right over your head. Because in the story, it talks about the star stopping right over the person's head, right there. And I just want you to know that planets never get over your head in Israel. They never do. Because Israel has almost a 32 north latitude. If you live in London, Chicago, Tokyo, any place that's far from the equator, does the sun ever get over your head, directly at the zenith? No. If you live near the equator, yes, it can. And this is true for all planets. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction did not come overhead. No planets do. Regulus would not come directly overhead ever in Israel either. only some stars could come directly overhead. So I think that the idea that the star rose and stopped overhead was not the zenith. It was what we call the meridian plane. It was an astrological overhead when planets reach their highest point in the sky. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because people have asked me, when did Jupiter and Saturn reach the zenith when Jesus, around the time Jesus was born? The answer is never. It'd get within about 6 degrees, a little bit bigger than your fist at best, when a planet is near zero Cancer, it gets highest in the sky in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, just want to make that point in case you're curious. Planets cannot reach the zenith in Jerusalem or Nazareth because they have a geographic latitude of about 32 north. So I don't think it was actually that literal. It's a beautiful idea that the star came overhead and stopped. Maybe there was a comet that traveled. I don't know. Probably not. So I don't think it was really quite that literal. Overhead, we use the word midheaven. We call it the highest point, but it's not literally the zenith. It's the highest point, just like what the sun does in the middle of the day. Its highest point, which is not at the zenith unless you're near the equator at certain times of the year. And just technically, for those of you interested, since we're going into technical details, the highest Jupiter, let's look at it this way. Up to a latitude of 25 north, Jupiter, in theory, on rare occasions, Jupiter could reach the zenith. Because you take 23.5, the tilt of the Earth's axis, plus the latitude, the inclination of the orbit. Jupiter's inclination of Jupiter's orbit is 1.5 degrees. You add that to 23.5, you get about 25. So it's only up to about 25 north geographic latitude that Jupiter could come overhead, and that would be extremely rare. The closer you are to the equator, the more likely something like Jupiter can come over your head. Once you get below 23.5, then it's going to be more frequent. Okay, so I doubt that the Bethlehem star was at the zenith. In a sense, it did stop when it reached its highest point in that it became invisible as the day began. I talked about that earlier. The sun rose, the stars started fading out. As Jupiter and Saturn reach the top of the sky and the sun gets a little bit above the horizon, it fades out. They live in was still a dry area, a clear, you could still see the stars a little bit as the sun's rising, and then they fade out. So, final conclusions of this whole series. Number one, I suspect that astronomer John Mosley's guess is completely correct, that the Star of Bethlehem is understood through astrological interpretation, not as a spectacular visual sight. The Star of Bethlehem was an extraordinary astrological event more than an extraordinary visual event. Perhaps a comet or nova reinforces the event, but it's not needed. We don't need a comet or nova to make this date of May 27, 7 BC, very special astrologically. We have a once-in-millennium sign in the heavens of a new cycle as the sun and moon give birth simultaneously with Jupiter and Saturn giving birth to a new kingdom. It is placed in Israel, where the sun and moon at new moon are rising. And as the moon moves and shows the unfolding story, it brings Regulus into the picture and also the manger. Conclusions also, the stories in the Bible are embellished a bit, and perhaps Jesus was not actually born in a manger, etc. So probably not every detail in the Bible story is literally true, but overall, the New Testament stories appear to be amazingly accurate. They're consistent with what has been found historically. Jesus actually did live. He actually was born around that time. The coming of the wise men predicting that the Messiah is born. All of this makes sense. It's consistent with what scholars understand about the history and the time period, the culture, and completely consistent with the May 27, 7 BC Star of Bethlehem, we can call it, that astrological configuration. It all fits together, it all makes sense, and indicates that the stories in the Bible are essentially true. The wise men came, they said, "Where's the king of the Jews?" It all fits together very nicely. The historical evidence and the astrology are in good agreement with the information given in the New Testament. Also, just to summarize some conclusions, the three wise men were expert astrologers whose calculations were highly accurate, and they placed an emphasis on planet positions and zodiac longitude, the power of the beginning of cycles, such as the lunar cycle and the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and they probably, no doubt, used things like the planets ruling zodiac signs, so that Moon-Venus conjunction in Cancer, conjunct the fixed star Precipe, so fixed stars, also important, and the unfolding pattern from that new moon would make sense based on the fact that astrology emphasized cycles and mundane affairs more than individual birth charts. This may, and the emphasis on the cycles especially makes sense because Jesus is a historical figure as the Son of God, and that there would be a sign in the heavens where divine messages are about it all makes sense. I also suspect, and this is a guess, but I'm guessing that the three wise men were also aware of the great year of 2,160 years. Maybe that's already been determined, or I think further historical research will confirm it. And they understood the great year the same way we do today as the movement of the vernal equinox through the sidereal zodiac. It's a bit speculative, but just to mention, I predict it will be confirmed if it hasn't already. So we found the Star of Bethlehem. It reached its most significant moment on May 27, 7 BC at 2:39 Universal Time in Israel. Now, so we found the Star of Bethlehem. We've put a lot of this story together, and I also hope that in better understanding some of the story of the Bible, that it also helps bring greater peace, joy, understanding, and a greater appreciation and love for all people in all places. Sometimes religion has helped with this, and of course sometimes it has not, as people conduct religious wars and, in the most dramatic cases, or just see other people as not quite up to the same standard as them because they're not interpreting things exactly the same way. So my real hope with all this is not just that we've learned some details of how things worked and what the Star of Bethlehem is and some of the astrology, but let's hope that it is in the spirit of Christmas and the real important message that Jesus brought to us and all world leaders and spiritual leaders bring, to bring greater joy, peace, and oneness and less sense of separateness between all of us. God bless. Namaste.